inflation is a hidden tax is because essentially it's devaluing your currency. And it's not as if there's some sort of, again, tax bill that Congress has to pass. Essentially, when the Federal Reserve starts engaging in things like quantitative easing, that's one of those terms that you hear being used, and they start pushing more money into the overall supply, in the overall economy, more what they call fiat currency, you wind up with this situation where the overall value of your dollar starts to go down. Right? And that's why Milton Friedman referred to it as a hidden tax, is because essentially that money that you have in the savings, or that dollar bill that you used to spend on something yesterday, doesn't buy as much as it does the next day or in the future, right? And that's why, in a way, what the government is doing is they're printing money and the government's spending it right away, so they're still getting to some degree the full value of that dollar. But as more money enters into the marketplace in exchange, the overall value of individual dollars goes down, and that affects you. And that's one of the reasons why you see prices raising. However, there's another argument, or there's another, let's just say, narrative with respect to why prices are rising, or people that are suggesting that inflation is not as bad as sometimes it's made out to be, or that there's different ways that the government can curb it without necessarily slowing down the rate at which they inflate the currency. So let's talk about some of that, right? One of the first things I want to hear, or one of the first things I want to discuss, is this whole concept of inflation is transitory, right? You've heard this from the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It's this idea that, inflation just kind of happens, and sometimes it goes up, and sometimes it goes down, and sometimes we have deflation, and this is just part of the natural process. Or is it, right? We're going to be answering that question on whether or not it's actually part of the natural process. Another thing that you hear a lot of times is that, no, it's not that inflation is causing prices to go up. It's greedy business owners, right? Greedy business owners who just, value profit above people and profit above their employees, and apparently just despise and hate their customers, are just arbitrarily raising prices because, after all, they're business owners. And that's how prices work, right? Business owners get together in small little cabals and, smoke-filled rooms, and they just decide what prices are going to be. That's another argument here. What's the third narrative we're going to discuss? And that is, well, what's the big deal? Why can't you print more money? After all, isn't a little bit of inflation a sign of a strong economy? Don't we need to just print more money in order to get it into the hands of more people? Because after all, if more people are spending money, that's good for the economy, right? It's this whole idea of aggregate demand and consumer spending. And as long as we have all that going on, it really doesn't matter how much we print, because ultimately it's going to be good for us economically, right? That's one of the third narratives that we see. And we're going to discuss all three of those today, so you know how to respond to them. Now, here's the first thing that we have to make sure everyone understands, right? First things first. There's a lot of people that think inflation is when prices go up, right? So they might go to the store, the price of the apple was $1 yesterday, today it's $1.10. Oh my gosh, inflation, because the price went up. That is not what inflation is. This is the first thing to understand about the whole concept of inflation. Inflation is a monetary concept, right? It's inflation is not simply because prices go up. Prices can go up for a number of reasons. Inflation is when prices go up, not because the intrinsic value of the actual object is in greater demand. It's not because supply has been restricted, right? It's none of those supply and demand reasons that typically cause prices to fluctuate. Inflation is when more currency has essentially been printed and put into the economy. Now, there's other ways it can happen, but the one we're focusing on here, because it's the one relevant to us, is this idea of fiat currency. And that's paper money that is not tied to anything. It's not tied to gold. It's not tied to silver. It's not even necessarily tied to exchange rates. It's primarily just tied to the good faith and credit of the United States government. So what the United States government is doing is it's saying, hey, look, we're going to tax you, and we will accept these little Federal Reserve notes as payment for taxes, right? And so we're going to print off these, and we're going to allow you to use them in the economy in order to facilitate trade and exchange. And so it's this idea that when they print more of those dollars, right, the individual value of each unit, each dollar, goes down, because money is actually a commodity, right? Because money, like a paper dollar, doesn't have any really intrinsic value in and of itself. What a paper dollar is good for is the goods and services you can get in exchange for it, right? It is a method of exchange. And the more of those units, right, the more of the method of exchange that you put out there, the less the individual value of each unit is actually worth in the economy. So it's not that the price of the apple went up because supply was down and demand was high. No, the price of the apple went up because there's more dollar bills within the economy, which makes the value of each dollar bill, less. And so now you need more of those dollar bills in order to actually command the same purchasing power that you did, a year ago or 2 years ago. So that's what inflation is, right? Inflation is not just prices going up, right? Prices are generally set in accordance with supply and demand, okay? But in inflation, the reason why prices are going up is because the government has printed off more money, printed off more dollar bills, and now each dollar bill has less purchasing power than it did previously. That's what inflation is. So don't be confused by people going out there and trying to suggest that, a business can lead to inflation by simply, charging more for its products. That's not inflation in the sense that we're talking about. Okay, so now that we know what inflation is, how do we address some of these narratives that we see coming up, predominantly from the left, but sometimes from the right as well, or even the center? And this is the first thing that we need to understand, right? So let's talk about that first claim, right? That inflation is transitory. All right, well, if it is, we're still waiting for a transition in the opposite direction, because what we've seen over the last, 100 plus years is this idea of the dollar being regularly devalued year after year with very, very few exceptions. All right, there are some, but very, very few exceptions. So let's talk about what that actually means. So if you look at the purchasing power of your dollar, so we're going to go all the way back to 100 years. So let's go back to 1921, right? We're in the year 2021. We're going back 100 years, 1921. Okay, so when you look at the total number of people in the population, the total number of dollars in circulation, at that time you actually had the dollar tied to everything from things like gold to exchange rates, things like that, which actually restricted the amount that the Federal Reserve could simply put out more money. What that means is that in 1921, your dollar was worth about 15 times what it is today, right? So the overall purchasing power of that single dollar was worth about, you'd need $15 in order to buy the same amount of goods today that you did back then, right? That's due to inflation. What about 50 years ago? Well, 50 years ago, you would need $1, you'd need $6 today to buy what $1 would buy 50 years ago. And now here's the crazy part. Just 10 years ago, the overall value of your dollar has gone down by over 20%. So over 20% just in the last 10 years, which means if you made $80,000 10 years ago and you got a $20,000 pay raise from 10 years ago to today, your overall purchasing power would be no greater because of inflation. Right? And not because they're, economic stagnation, but because the Federal Reserve has been continually printing out more money, you would have to make $20,000 more now than you did 10 years ago in order to essentially have the exact same purchasing power. So it's important to understand that a lot of times when politicians are out there pointing the finger at greedy business or, greedy entrepreneurs or capitalism or whatnot, one of the primary reasons why your paycheck doesn't go as far today as it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, is because of the politicians which are printing out this money at breakneck paces in order to facilitate either their spending or to butter up the cronyists sometimes on Wall Street, right? Because again, this is one of the things that you know about this podcast, about where I stand, is that I am a pro-free market guy. That doesn't mean I trust every business owner out there. It doesn't mean I trust every corporation out there. I trust a free and open process. And when I see people, whether they be within the government sector or in the private sector, attempting to use government to manipulate things, to manipulate the marketplace on their behalf, that's not capitalism, that's cronyism, and I despise it. And that's the problem that we have going on right now, is again, that there is an incentive for government officials to keep printing money because either they don't want to be the president that saw a market correction, or they want to be able to spend a lot of money on government projects, but they don't want to have to tax people because there's a certain degree to where people will not accept more taxes. Or there's a certain degree where you can tax where you actually get less revenue because you've actually discouraged productive economic behavior. And so they use the printing press in order to try to get what they want, right? That is problematic. And when we look at this whole idea, is inflation transitory? Well, it seems to only be, transitory in one direction, which kind of violates this whole idea of transitory in the way that we expect it when they're talking about this. So let me give you another example of Now, you could come back with the argument that, okay, well, maybe inflation was bad at different times within our economy, wartime, things like that. There was some sort of extreme circumstances. We had COVID. Maybe that's why the government had to print all this money. Here's what you need to understand about the current amount of money, amount of U.S. Federal Reserve notes within the U.S. economy right now. 40% of all U.S. dollars currently in circulation were printed in the last 2 years, right? Over 40%. So think about that. Half of the money supply that we currently have in the economy was printed within the last 2 years. That is massive printing. And we're at a point right now, that's why you're seeing like 5% inflationary rates, going month to month. That's horrible. That is why you're seeing an increase on prices across the board, is because even if we do have better supply systems, even if you do have less demand for something, the equilibrium is completely thrown off the way it would otherwise operate within the marketplace because the government keeps printing money and throwing it into the economy. So the overall value of your dollar is going down significantly over the last 2 years because of government monetary policy. Not greedy businesses, politicians and the Federal Reserve making an active decision. And now I will say this, there are businesses, especially within the stock market and Wall Street, that are pressuring the government to continue to, expand this everything bubble that we're currently finding ourselves in as a result, in large part, because of the monetary policy that the federal government is pushing. So there is blame to go around among both government entities and members of the private sector that are asking for this. The important thing to understand, though, is that the reason why I primarily blame the government for this is because the government is the one that has the power to do it. The government can come back and say, look, this is inappropriate. We should not be printing money at this rate. We need to rein in our spending. We need to get our fiscal policy under control, and we need to get our monetary policy. The government has the exclusive power to be able to do that, and they refuse to do it. So that's why they get the main part of my ire from me.